So now that the technical difficulties are behind us, we're going to move on with today's lecture. And this lecture is one in the Sidore series lectures. And before I introduce our wonderful speaker, I'd like to thank Sidore family for the funds that it provides annually to be able to bring exciting, new, sometimes controversial speakers to the UNH campus for the students and the public community to be able to partake of their knowledge. I would also like to thank the Center for the Humanities and all my colleagues here who have put so much effort into writing the proposal and being able to get this series going. I finally would like to thank Jennifer McGreedy. She's not here, but she's the person who is responsible for all the arrangements, including travel and food, and those you know are fundamentally important to social relations anywhere. So I'd like to introduce Zoe Kontes. She is an associate professor and the chair of the Department of Classics at Kenyon College. She holds a BA of Classics from Baldwin College and a PhD in Old World Archaeology and Art from Brown University. She studied at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens under a Fulbright Fellowship, and she has excavated in Sicily, Greece, and Cyprus. Prior to Kenyon College, she taught for 3 years at Duke University. At Kenyon, her research and award-winning teaching focuses on classical archaeology and issues of cultural property. In 2015, she wrote a New York Times op-ed on the repatriation of antiquities, and in 2016, she received a Whiting Public Engagement Fellowship to produce Looted. Looted is a narrative podcast series on the illicit trade in antiquities, which also draws on her experience as a college radio DJ. Yeah, indie rock rocks, right? You can listen to Looted, and that's a little, product plug in here at www.lootedpodcast.org. Tonight, she will address issues of this illicit trade by examining artifacts currently or formerly held by museums in this country, United States, to show what is lost when an object is removed from the ground without proper excavation. Her talk is entitled Lost versus Found Loot in U.S. Museums. Please help me to welcome Zoe Kontes to UNH.
Thank you. Sorry about the delay. Thanks to the Center for the Humanities and the Sidore Lecture Series for the opportunity to speak tonight, and to Professor Smith for the invitation. Can you hear me okay? Thanks also to Professor Piskova for the introduction and to Jen McCready for setting everything up. And thank you all for coming. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here tonight. Rather than ownership of the past, I'd like to focus on stewardship tonight. How can we best protect the world's past for the future? And why should we? The artifacts I will show you tonight will demonstrate how we have failed in this stewardship at times by examining objects in museums that have lost their context. Conversely, I will give some examples of what we can learn when we find similar objects in context. Good stewardship combined with education and public engagement are the best means of preserving the past. Knowledge of the past provides a shared identity, not only for local associated cultures and their history, but also for all of civilization and our common human history. Since many of you here tonight are studying these issues this year, you will not be surprised to hear that while the objects I will be showing you are from long-gone civilizations, the destruction of an illicit trade in antiquities is alive and thriving. In fact, we are living in a time of unprecedented destruction of cultural heritage. I know that previous speakers in this series have spoken to you about the travesties in Syria, to some of the oldest and most important sites for the history of human civilization, including Palmyra, the crossroads of a multitude of cultures. The intersection of cultures should strike us as distinctly familiar. Questions of cultural interaction are paramount in modern society. These are issues that were also paramount in the ancient Mediterranean, and many of the artifacts I will show you tonight represent those interactions. For instance, What happened to the indigenous people of Sicily after the Greek colonizers started showing up in the 8th and 7th century BC? How did the 18th century AD Christian Greeks interact with their Muslim Ottoman conquerors? What about the connections between the 15th century BC cultures of mainland Greece and the island of Crete? These are all questions which archaeology can shed light on. Knowledge about these ancient interactions can help us to understand our own interactions, and looting destroys the opportunity to acquire this knowledge and make use of it. Looting happens not just on a massive scale, but often in a more local scale manner. I'll start off with my own first experience with this kind of looting. What you're looking at on the screen is the 4th century BC town of Palikè, and it was inhabited by the local people known as the Sicels, but came under the influence of a new Greek world of colonizers, and the mix of the two cultures can be seen in the evidence from the excavations. Earlier this century, we were excavating 5 by 5 meter trenches at the site, methodically recording the evidence. One morning we arrived to see that looters had come with their metal detectors and dug holes straight through our stratigraphy and taken objects. Whatever it was they found, we'll never know. They were certainly looking for coins, but they might have found nails. We don't know what it was, something metal. Their goal would have been coins, as I said, and if they found them, they might have brought a small price on the market. Their value for understanding the site, however, would have been much more significant if found in context. Coins can give us a date for our site and indicate who the people at the site were communicating with, were interacting with. Around the Mediterranean, looting follows this same pattern of local small-scale thieves who get paid a tiny fraction of what the objects may eventually bring on the market. Even outside of conflict zones, looting is occurring regularly and with increasing frequency as the market becomes more sophisticated through technology. Today, these small-scale looters can skip the middleman, the dealers, and sell their wares right to collectors on eBay, for instance. If you Google eBay right now, you can find some Sicilian coins for sale. You can buy them while I'm talking. But it's the big collections of dealers which have recently aided in our understanding of the vast scale of the illicit trade, particularly in the US, one of the biggest market countries for these looted objects. A number of important raids made between 1995 and 2015 as the result of art police squads and international collaboration have uncovered troves of looted artifacts like you see here. But almost more importantly, since these objects have already been stripped of their context, it exposed the connection between dealers and collectors, museums and auction houses, and their illicit activity. Dealers kept careful archives of their businesses, indicating how freely they had been able to operate and how above the law, which led to some high-profile repatriation cases. This image shows you the archive of a dealer named Bakina, who we'll come back to. The market encourages this looting, and a look at almost any museum label will reveal what has been lost by this illicit trade. Since we're in the US, my examples will come from museums in this country, but this is a fact wherever looted antiquities are on display. All right, so I'm just going to start with a couple of artifacts I recently saw that reflect what we can learn from looking more closely at museum labels. This is a sculpture in the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's a contemporary art museum, so it's not an archaeology museum. We can give it like a little bit of leeway, but still, this is pretty vague, right? What does the label say? Greco-Roman. That could be anywhere on the Mediterranean or the Black Sea or beyond. There's no marker of whether this is BC or AD. Okay, just there's the date. And youth, that's all. You can say nothing else about this object. The purchase date of 1971 is also suspicious. According to a UNESCO agreement, which the US is party to, museums should not be buying anything that came out of the ground after 1970. Where was this prior to 1971? It's a good question. We have no idea. The sculpture is held in the Art Before 1300 gallery, and that's as much context as you get. If you work with prehistory, that 1300 could be either side, right, of the divide. There's another piece in this gallery, same gallery, Art Before 1300, which in fact could apply either AD or BC. This one is a gift to the museum in 1975. Interesting, right? You might think. What is it? Oh, sure. It's a frying pan, right? Well, I'm here to tell you it's not a frying pan. It's definitely not a frying pan. The fine context of these things is primarily in graves in the Cyclades, which are the small islands in the Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey. And they're usually found in graves, as I said. Sometimes they'll be imported to the mainland, and in that case, they're found in domestic contexts. But in neither place are they ever used for cooking. So it's not a frying pan. What is it? We're not really sure. A 2008 study suggested maybe a mirror. So you flip it over, it's hollow, put some water in, and then you can look at yourself. Who knows? A 2015 study suggested maybe that the writing on it is some sort of calendar, tells you something about astronomical phenomena. Again, we don't know, but we do know that it's not a frying pan. And so sometimes a label in the museum is just flat out wrong. Okay, so just to be clear, I know how cool it is to see ancient artifacts firsthand. I love museums, and for my students, a museum can make the ancient world come to life. I hope you've had that experience, or you will. I recently had the chance to visit the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago, which I've been dying to go see this collection. I was so excited. And they have an absolutely beautiful display of pristine classical objects. I could only find one in the entire collection whose label indicated where the object came from. I also overheard a docent telling a group of tourists that the most famous statue of the most successful Roman emperor ever, Augustus, which inspired the later version you see here on the left, on display in the museum, was definitely Julius Caesar. Okay, so this type of error might be prevented if we had more than this information from the label. This is what the label says: torso of a Roman emperor, Roman, late 1st, early 2nd century AD, marble. That's it, nothing else. On the right, the object's label reads Hellenistic or Roman, so even broader, Eastern Mediterranean. That's a huge geographical area. 100 BC to 100 AD. Again, a very wide range of dates. And on the label, in quotes, one of the very few large-scale bronzes to have survived from antiquity. This is true. These things are extremely rare and extremely important, so finding one's a really big deal. But this one lacks any context whatsoever. So it can tell us nothing about, for instance, who made it or why they made it or where it came from. Both these objects are on recent anonymous loans to the museum. The publication of this collection bemoans the fact that the museum can't buy antiquities anymore and champions these loans as invigorating the collection. From a scientific perspective, however, it's a harsh reminder of everything we have lost. Let's bring this a little closer to home. Here's an example at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston of a 3rd millennium BC Cycladic figure. It's an anthropomorphic type made of white marble and found predominantly in graves. However, on a recent trip to the museum, this is going to sound like all I do is go to museums. It is pretty much all I do. So I went to the MFA, and I was looking for this figure and others in the collection, in vain, because they're not on display right now. In addition, incredulously, when I asked multiple people where to find them, I was told that, in fact, the Greeks didn't make sculpture. So, okay. They did, of course. So these figures, you may have seen them before, they have an average size of 8 to 20 inches. But we have some examples that are nearly 5 feet tall. This comes from the National Museum in Athens. Abstract and mostly female, their facial features can consist of simply a prominent carved nose, but painted details are sometimes used. While they're typically displayed standing upright in museum collections, their pointed feet indicate that they could not have stood on their own. Many suggestions have been made as to the function of these objects. It's not necessarily the case that they only had a single function. They have been proposed to be images of ancestors or divinities, talismans to ward off bad spirits, in common dangerous activities in early Bronze Age island life, like seafaring, representations of the deceased, or even toys. Our uncertainty lies in the loss of contextual information, and not, as suggested by one museum label, that the significance or function of these sculptures created in a pre-literate society is necessarily unknown beyond the fact that most have been recovered from graves. It's necessarily unknown because they've been looted, not because you can't know something about them at all. Most Cycladic graves never contained a figure, yet they were destroyed by the search for them. When they first came to public attention in the 19th century, the figures were considered ugly and even barbaric, but by the middle years of the 20th century, their aesthetic appealed to modernist artists. In the 1950s and 60s, large numbers of these figurines began to appear on the international market. Today, there are thought to be 1,600 in existence, as you can see, though the large majority were not known before the 1960s and do not have an origin that can be traced back to an actual archaeological site. And some percentage of the figures are almost certainly fakes. So we'll leave the MFA and the National Museum just for a minute to go to Cincinnati for our next example. It's a relatively big one that they have in the Cincinnati collection. It's 18 inches, and it doesn't have feet, right? So it would have been bigger. And as you can see, it was purchased in 1960. It's a highlight of a new exhibit in 2016, which I visited last spring. In the collection on display, there was not a single artifact with a provenience. And that's the same that goes for Cleveland Museum of Art. I'm coming here from Ohio, so that's why those two are included. But I'll come back to Cleveland. They're going to get their due in this talk. These works inspired modern artists of the time, Brancusi, Henry Moore, Picasso, and these further fueled their popularity. At least the Henry Moore, which you can see here, is actually reclining, which these figures would have had to do with their pointy feet, if they still had them, unlike this one in Cincinnati. They would have also been lying down. Apparently, at least in Cincinnati, they are still inspiring art. Artistic license apparently includes removing any indication of anatomy. Okay, this is the Cincinnati Museum t-shirt. What is really exciting is when we can learn about these objects from proper excavations. And new results from recent excavations are providing a whole new perspective of these figures whose anything about them has been lost essentially since the 1960s. On the island of Kouros, which you see here on the map, archaeologists have been studying a cache of these objects, which has revealed itself as a group of figurines broken in antiquity and transported here from other places. Not a single fragment of a figurine matches another. The excavators are positing some kind of sanctuary connected to a nearby building in use seasonally. And specialist studies such as on metallurgy and faunal remains, just to name two, are being done on many aspects of the site. So it's really exciting what could come out of this research. Lest we think the problem for these figurines has been solved, here's a recent auction in 2010 of one of them. There is no mention of its original context, just its modern provenance, or its ownership history, which I have blown up for you there, which you will see, eventually you'll see that this reads like a trail of criminals. Keep the names Robin Symes, listed here, and Phoenix Ancient Art in mind, because I'm going to come back to those two. Relating to the object to a master, which they've done here, the Schuster master, okay, is a school of thought that claims to recognize the work of a certain artist on these particular figures. And this is pretty ludicrous, okay? We don't have that many of them to say that one person necessarily made this one, and he was the Schuster master. It's pretty unlikely. But what it does is it increases the value of the piece, right? Because everybody wants a famous artist to make their art. As you can see, or hopefully you can see if it's not too small, while estimated at 3 to 5 million, it sold for 16 million. This big, right? This is not small potatoes. Okay. We have also another master figure at the Met. This one is the Bastisse master. And again, the name is just attempting to add value to the price. And this one goes so far as to describe the figure in a very anachronistic art historical term of mannerism, right? The mannerism is characteristic of the Bastisse master. It's pretty ludicrous. Okay, so if you look, note also, hold on, yeah, the name of the dealer, Kouros. So we've got Symes so far, Phoenix Ancient Art, and then this guy, Kouros. I'm going to come back to all three of them. We'll return to the MFA for our next object. Okay, we'll stay close to home. This one is also from the Cyclades. You can see it's very similar in its marble and sort of overall appearance. And if we look at the provenance, or the modern history of this bowl, the Cycladic bowl, we find that there are a lot of questions to be asked. So first of all, these things come from the Cycladic Islands. This one, said to have been found, is always an alert there, said to have been found, which means we have no idea where it was found. Near Marathon. You've probably heard of Marathon. It's not on an island, okay, it's on the Greek mainland. So what's it doing in Marathon? What are the connections between this site, this is where it was really found, and the sites, the cultures on the islands where these things were really produced? When was it found? So you'll see that Kouros comes up again here, and also Symes. Kouros claims that it was in his ownership in the 1940s. The site was not excavated until the 1970s. So either he's making up the dates entirely, or it's clearly does not come from an actual excavation. Okay, so keep those names in mind so that I can tell you that Symes, here depicted in this picture, is one of the dealers that I mentioned whose archives have been found and have, because their archives have been found, we've been able to locate lots of looted objects in museums, and we will continue to see this with the objects throughout this talk. So he's recently been caught up in selling looted artifacts. Another name that comes from that same very expensive Cycladic figurine, the Phoenix Ancient Art that I pointed out. It's from these dealers that we'll turn to an object at the Cleveland Museum of Art. Phoenix Ancient Art sold them this bronze, which, as I already mentioned, it's pretty rare to have a life-size bronze from the ancient world, and this is one of the few. It appeared on the art market out of nowhere in 2003, so completely with no history, shows up in 2003. It's thought, and you can see the name here, Apollo the Python Slayer, or Apollo Soroctonos, Apollo the Lizard Slayer. It's thought to be described by Pliny, an ancient writer, a sculpture that was actually described by him as having been made by Praxiteles. Okay, so he's a very famous Greek sculptor. Again, you attach a name, like a big famous name, to an ancient sculpture, suddenly it becomes much more valuable. It made this one almost irresistible to the Cleveland Museum of Art, even though we're talking about a very late date, okay, 2004, when they purchased this object, and basically no history for the object. And what you see here, and there's a lot of words I know, the important ones are in yellow. The Apollo Soroctonos, introduced by the ancient Greek sculptor Praxiteles, that's the big deal for them. And then at the end, by far the most important work of classical sculpture to come to light and to be acquired by a North American art museum since World War II. That's a pretty bold statement, right? It's a big deal. Michael Bennett, the museum's curator of Greek and Roman art, adds, "This magnificent sculpture has several stylistic and technical features that we associate with monumental classical Greek bronzes and ancient testimony attributing Praxiteles and Apollo Soroctonos in bronze greatly adds to the work's importance." That's an understatement, because in fact Michael Bennett claims that this is the sculpture made by Praxiteles, the very one, the only surviving Greek sculpture by a named artist in the world, which is an interesting claim considering we have no idea where it came from. The story is that it came from an East German estate, which was reclaimed in 1991 after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's very convenient to claim that your artifacts come from a war-torn area, or an area like East Berlin in the Second World War where there's nothing you can know about it. It's extremely convenient because there's no way for anybody to prove that it wasn't there. There's no record of the object between 1994 and 2002. Who owns it? It shows up in 2003, as I said, on the art market, and the Cleveland Museum of Art bought it from Phoenix Ancient Art. And Phoenix Ancient Art is made up of these two brothers, Ali and Hicham Abutam. This is what we know about them, okay? Ali was convicted in Egypt of dealing in illegal antiquities. The Swiss also discovered their warehouse in Geneva of looted antiquities. Hicham was convicted of falsifying documents in New York City, also in order to make objects seem legal when they weren't. And their own website, which I'm showing you here, clearly indicates where their interests lie. Each object that Phoenix Ancient Art acquires is personally selected by us for its intrinsic beauty, aesthetic value, and historical importance. It's like they threw that one in just at the end, especially if it has a named sculptor. That's great, very historically important. Okay, so this seems sketchy, right? Does it seem sketchy to you? It should seem sketchy. But Cleveland said, no, it's totally fine. And maybe you're thinking, no, museums are not buying looted antiquities anymore. Maybe they did this in, the early part of the 19th, 20th century even, but not now, right? This is crazy. They're not doing that. Well, you can probably guess. I'll try and change your mind about that. In 2012, Cleveland Museum of Art bought another object from Phoenix Ancient Art. This one is a Roman marble head, Drusus Minor. He gets a name, which also makes him important. And you can see, purchased in 2012. This is not that long ago, and it's certainly after 1970, right? All right. When doubts were expressed by scholars about the legitimacy of this purchase, this is how the museum director at the time responded. We did as much, if not more, than anyone could have done to research this object. If all the arrows are pointing in one direction, you can make a reasoned assumption. That should already sound a little flimsy to you. And then further down, he also points to the long-term protection the Drusus head will now get, as it never would out on the open market, passing from collector to collector. All right, so we're saving it from obscurity, right? We're bringing it to the public. We've rescued it, really. We're doing the world a favor here in Cleveland. And we've done our homework. We've been very thorough, more than anyone could have done, right? 5 years later, this is last spring, April 2017, you can read the headlines. Cleveland Museum of Art returns ancient Roman portrait of Drusus, learning it was stolen from Italy in World War II. And not just stolen from the country, stolen from a museum. This is an actual excavated object from a site called Sessa Arunca in 1926. It was put into the museum. It was illegally removed from the museum, so stolen from the museum during World War II. And then there it shows up in Cleveland. Remember, Cleveland said they did their homework as much as anyone could do. This comes from another museum. I mean, it's shocking. Are you shocked? Okay, it's shocking. Okay, museums don't always do their homework, right? And they sometimes purposely conceal where they have acquired objects. This was the case in the high-profile story of the 6th century pot from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which you may recognize from the posters. You may have heard about this. It's an extremely high-profile repatriation case, the Euphroneous crater. And this crater, which was in the Met from 1971 on, also was returned finally because of finding one of these archives of a dealer. In this case, it was the Medici Archive. The Met knew that this object had been looted from the very beginning. They refused to admit it until the discovery of the archive, and eventually it went back to Italy in 2008. It was looted from a tomb near the Italian town of Cerveteri, which is in an area north of Rome where the Etruscan culture, and there are many, many tombs there which are extremely wealthy and valuable for looters. It's a place where lots of things have been stolen over the years and continue to be. It was sold by Medici, a dealer, as you can see, for $88,000, to the next dealer up the chain, Robert Hecht, and we'll come back to him as well, so try and remember that name, for $350,000. And then Hecht made quite a deal when he sold it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1972 for $1 million, which at the time was an incredible sum, like nobody had ever seen before. And it made a huge splash in the museum world. It had its own, in Times Magazine, it had its own fold-out, kind of like a pop-up book where you could see the Euphroneous crater. It was really a spectacular, a blockbuster event for the Met. And they were not keen to give it up. In fact, they didn't even care, and here's Philippe de Montebello, who was the director of the museum at the time, about the context. 98% of everything we need to know, we know about antiquity, we know from objects that were not out of digs, which is an interesting way to put it. How much more would you learn from knowing which particular hole, supposedly in Cerveteri, it came out of? Everything is on the vase. Everything being style and iconography and nothing else, right? Looking at it doesn't tell you who made it, where the clay came from, why they made it, who it was buried with, what it was buried with, what was done with it. It tells you nothing. So, what's the story? They found the archives. There's our friend Hecht, okay? And the archives, Hecht is, as an aside, of department store fame. If anybody's from the Maryland area, Hecht's was a chain of department stores, which I think no longer exists. But anyway, that's where he came from. And in this archive, there was a Polaroid picture of him standing proudly with the pot in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it led to a raid on his apartment in which there was an entire memoir explaining how the pot had been looted, because he was so proud of this amazing deal he had made to sell it to the Metropolitan. Part of that archive was also this handwritten sheet, which you see, which I'll show you now, in typeset, so you can read it a little bit better. It's really small, huh? You can't read it at all. Okay. I will tell you what's on it. It's a list of the names of all of these dealers, including Hecht. He's right at the top in the big letters. And then underneath is Bekina, who I started out with, and I'll come back to him. Koutoulakis, our old friend with the Marathon Bowl, and also the Cycladic figurine. Medici, okay, and Symes isn't on this, but he's connected. So what this organogram did was really give us the network for these dealers and how they're working. And they were all very connected and connected to the museums. So eventually, the crater, because of this organogram, because of the absolute proof at this point, they were also were found the actual looters. Only one was still alive, but he explained everything that happened and where the pot had come from. And eventually, the Met had no choice but to return it in 2008 to the site, which is one of the most beautiful places in the world, I think, the site of Cerveteri. This is a tomb there. This is not the tomb where the pot came out of, but a similar tomb in this area. In 2008, the pot went back to Rome. where it was for a while on display, and then it was finally moved in 2015 back to the local museum, which is where I saw it last March. Here it is in its glass box, and behind it is another artifact from the same artist, Euphronius. So it is now as close to where it came from as it has ever been in its history since 1971. It is also advertising for its triumphant restitution seems to have fallen by the wayside. In this case, by the men's room, which is where I found this thing. This is my pictures of my spring break with this giant cardboard cutout of the crater. I don't know what they did with it, but it's very exciting that it's back where it belongs because of finding these archives. And basically there's no more arguing that the thing was looted and where it came from. At this site, I'll just go back for a second, is not a place where there's just small-scale looting. This is big scale. These are people who are extremely well-versed in looting because the payoff is so big, to the point that the Italian art police fly over these tombs. There are hundreds of them, thousands, in order to look for looters. And the looters go so far as to build mounds over the mounds, fake mounds over the funerary mounds, so that they can't be spotted from the air by the police flying over. It's incredible. And this is still happening. Okay, we'll speed past that. So we'll stick with Mr. Hecht for a minute for our next example, and we'll go back to the MFA. Dealers are not just responsible for these big one-hit wonders like the Euphronius crater that we just saw, and that are so special that you can even find the exact hole that they came out of. Rather, they have facilitated the devastation of entire classes of objects, varying by decade when they were popular on the art market. We've already seen what happened to Cycladic figurines. About 20 years later, we see a similar situation with 4th century BC vases from the southern Italian region of Apulia. This one, as you can see, was a gift to the MFA in 1970, convenient date, from Robert Hecht. Making a gift does not make it okay, by the way. He also sold many others of this exact kind of vase to museums and collectors that have showed up in Polaroids in dealers' archives. It has been estimated that more than 94% of these pots have no secure archaeological context. Their elaborate luxe style was appreciated by the aesthetic of the 80s and 90s in this country. You can see how the minimalist style of those Cycladic figurines fits with the 60s, 50s and 60s, and this fits more with the fabulous 80s. And you'll see from the labels, we're not going to look at very many, but you would see that the dates are very often in the 80s and 90s. The Met has whole bunches of these, so you can go and see when they got them. In an area where the interactions of Greeks and Italians who loved their pots and created their own production of these vases, we have almost no information about the context of these objects. Because they were ripped from graves, we do not know what else was found in the tomb. For example, were there other pots or sculpture? Who were the bodies? What gender were they? What other objects were found with them? All we have left to go on, which according to the Met at one time was all you needed, is style and iconography. Deliberate destruction of the funerary record of ancient Apulia has caused extensive and permanent loss of knowledge. So what can we learn about the interactions of ancient cultures when we can study them in context? This is the found part of the talk. That was the whole loss, and now we're found. I had the opportunity to work at the important site of Corinth in the Peloponnese, which was significant in both the Greek and Roman worlds, and later occupations of the site have also been carefully excavated. So I'm going to start with the recently old and go back to some extremely old stuff. This is an image, this will seem recent to you probably, 18th century AD. It's recent compared to what we've been looking at. And there's a skeleton that I dug up in Corinth and next to it is the notebook where we recorded this digging. And it's from an early Ottoman cemetery in the 1700s. What's really interesting about this cemetery is that there are Christian and Muslim burials together. So side by side, you find these burials. There's a difference. There are clear differences between them. So the Muslim burials have their heads facing Mecca, their arms are at their sides, there are no grave goods. The Christian burials have their arms crossed across their chests, and they have grave goods. This particular guy, my guy, grave number 70, was a middle-aged man with a brain tumor. And he had lots of other old and new injuries. But this is really, it's cool, right, that we can figure out these things from the bones because it's been properly excavated. This is pretty late as far as excavations go in Greece, but Corinth has always been very keen to record everything, to record every stage, which is really great for later studies. And the fact that we can study these bones is really interesting. But what's really interesting from my perspective tonight is that this mixing of the cultures didn't exist in the 16th century, and they seem to be intermarrying. So the genetic evidence from the bones tells us that they were intermarrying, which is really interesting, right? Considering the situation in Greece today. So could this help us think about our current situation? Could we think more, perhaps, as to the situation with immigration into Greece today? Another recent example, recent excavation, not a recent object, is the 2015, this is from the New York Times, you may have seen it, excavation of the so-called Griffin warrior, so-called because a plaque inside the grave depicted a griffin on it. This is an excavation by the University of Cincinnati, Jack Davis and Sherry Stocker. And this grave was found, it's a single grave, one guy in it. Here, I'll show you the drawing rendering of it and where it was and some of the objects from the grave. It's very close to the surface, so people have been walking over it for years in this excavation. And it's extremely, extremely important for understanding the period of interaction between the Bronze Age Minoan culture on Crete and the Mycenaean culture on the mainland. When it's fully published, it will have a picture of what these Minoan objects symbolized for Mycenaean culture, which trying to figure out the meaning of something to a Bronze Age culture is very difficult. And so we don't have a lot of opportunity to do this. We don't have a lot of single burials from this period. Oftentimes there are multiple skeletons, so we don't know how the objects relate to particular burials. In this case, we do. And so it's a very, very exciting excavation. As the New York Times said, it could be a gateway to civilizations. I'm not really sure what that means. But at any rate, it's exciting stuff. Here's an example of another thing they can do in modern excavations. It's a little terrifying. It's just a pretty intense restoration. They can do this facial reconstruction from the bones of what the warrior looked like around age 30 to 35 at his death. So this excavation is really a model for stewardship and education. It's been published rapidly. So 2 articles have already come out about the grave since 2015. So as far as archaeological research, that's good, that's fast, and they're disseminating the knowledge, and works of all kinds of experts have been put on this tomb of the warrior. So it's really, really interesting to see what's going to happen with it, and it can give us a lot more information than we have already. So it's not just, oh, here's some bones and here's some stuff. It's really, really important, and it will take us very far in understanding this early Mycenaean culture. Okay, so one final example. In 1985, a well-known antiquities dealer named Gianfranco Becchina, and it was his archive that I showed you in the very beginning of my talk, who is also an olive oil magnate who reportedly supplied the White House with olive oil. So he's a very, it's a pretty decent olive oil business. He sold the Getty, the so-called very troubled Getty Kouros for $9 million, this marble thing that you see in front of you. Standing male nude sculpture, supposedly from the 6th century BC. So much debate arose regarding its authenticity that it is now labeled like this, which you might not be able to read. It says Greek around 530 BC or modern forgery. This label itself is already outdated by 10 years. I took this picture in 2014, so actually add 4 more years to that. But it stood labeled as authentic for at least 15. The sculpture is most likely a pastiche, so combination of different stylistic components from other sculptures, but it's most closely modeled on this Kouros, which is just a standing male nude, which was discovered in Greece in 1937 and sawn in half. You can see the saw marks going across his middle there, and put in 2 suitcases and smuggled to Paris. This one has eventually gone back to Greece. Becchina's archive has recently been found, which we looked at the beginning, as I mentioned, and which contained thousands of looted antiquities and careful records of many others that had passed through his hands. Lots of them were Polaroid pictures depicting objects actually still with the dirt on them before they were sold to museums and other collectors. But all of that is just an aside to tell you how involved Becchina was. What I really want to look at is the guy behind the Getty Kouros, that bronze. Okay, you've seen probably not half, but almost half of the bronzes that exist from the ancient world in this talk tonight. And here is a more close-up image of that guy. This is his before and after. Before, when you can see that he's come out of the sea, okay, he's covered in barnacles, and then he's been cleaned up, made to look presentable. The year is 1964, and fishermen off the coast of Italy haul in a surprising catch. This barnacle-encrusted ancient bronze statue. Mistaking it for a dead body at first, they soon realize what they've got, and they decide to sell it rather than report it to the authorities. After a series of hiding places, including a short stay in a priest's bathtub and a cabbage field, the nude male figure of a young athlete crowning himself, that's what he's doing like this, gets sold up the chain of the antiquities market via Brazil, Germany, and London, so he travels the world. And by 1977, the Getty Museum in Los Angeles pays almost $4 million for it. That's the equivalent of around $15 million today. So this is a big deal. Guess how much the original fishermen and associated priests, cabbage farmers got for it? $5,000 total for all of them together. So you can see it doesn't really pay to be the low guy on the looting pole. The 3rd through 2nd century BC bronze youth, a very rare find, became an instant star in the museum's classical collection, where it remains today. Here's the problem. Italy wants it back. Here's the problem for Italy. The fishermen were fishing in international waters. The Getty claims that it purchased it legally. It was smuggled out of Italy, went through the chain, purchased legally. Italian law, however, prohibits the export of any antiquities from its borders. So Italy says no matter where it was found in the water, it came onto Italian soil, therefore it belongs to the Italian state. The Getty can't buy it. Where is the statue originally from? Greece, most likely. How did it get where it was? Probably shipwrecked in the Roman period, who were the original looters of Greek art. It could have told us something about these interactions, right? If it weren't dug up by the fishermen. So where does this artifact belong? If it's legal for the Getty to have the statue, is it ethical? This question is still being debated in the Italian courts. In fact, a judge was just heard the final arguments from both the Getty and the Italian state on February 5th, and he has 90 days to decide to make his decision. But it's gone back and forth from the courts in this country and the courts in Italy for a long time now. And in a blockbuster exhibit, which in 2015, 2016, this was a very cool exhibit of 50 bronzes from the Hellenistic period that traveled from the Getty to Florence and then back to the National Gallery of Art where I saw it. Guess which of these pieces, and you can see our friend over there on the left, did not go to Florence with the rest of them. So 49 fabulous pieces went to Florence because they knew it wouldn't come back, right? If you send it back to Italy, it's not coming back to the Getty. I saw it in the National Gallery, as I mentioned, where it was depicted like this. Does anybody know where this is standing? Do you recognize this? Olympia. Okay. So Olympia. Good work, Scott. All right. So where did this thing come from? It's in international waters off the coast of Italy. What's it doing in Olympia in this museum exhibit? It's not. I mean, it's an athlete. Okay, that's what it's doing in Olympia. And as you can see, you can't see it around the entire podium, but there's no label on this whatsoever. So you walk into this exhibit, you see, wow, here's this fabulous sculpture from Olympia, if you knew that this was Olympia. To find out what this was, you had to go to a really far away wall and see a little tiny plaque that said victorious athlete, also known as the Getty bronze, which is what it's been known as for a long time. In Italy, it's not known as the Getty bronze. It's known as the Fano athlete. Fano is the town closest to where it was found in Italy. Okay, so we know nothing about this piece, really, and we never will, even if it goes back to Italy. We're not going to know anything more about it. But we do have a couple of bronzes that have been found in actual excavations and that we can learn something about. And in fact, we can learn a lot about these. These are pretty famous, so you may have seen them before. On the left is the Delphi charioteer, and it represents, it commemorates a victory in a chariot race of a tyrant from Sicily, the tyrant Gela. Again, with these intercultural connections that we can learn from finding these things. This is very rare because it was found actually in a dirt excavation. Most of the time, these objects are found in the water. Do you know why that is? Why bronzes are found in the water? They're often on ships because the Romans were stealing them. But metals in general were ballast on ships, and metals are valuable no matter what. So if you have a metal object, very often it will get melted down. And so because they were on ships, we have some of them remaining. And the one on the right is the youth from Antikythera, which is a site you may have heard of. It's the site of the very famous Antikythera mechanism, supposedly the world's first computer, first analog computer, predicts dates. This is a Roman shipwreck that the sculpture was found on, also this machine, but it's a Greek object, so it has, again, some interesting connections. And most recently, the shipwreck has been re-excavated, and they're actually finding human skeletons. This shipwreck was first excavated in the very beginning of the 20th century, so around 1900, 1901. They didn't have the techniques that we have today when they found the statue and the Antikythera mechanism. But now they're digging it again and finding bones, and they may even be able to get some DNA from those bones, which will tell us some really interesting things. Here's a grotesque bone, just to wake you up at the very end of my talk. It's a jawbone, so I'm not sure what they're doing with that. But at any rate, the idea is you can learn a whole lot from this excavation on land or under the water. And this is something that we cannot learn, right, from all the objects I've shown you tonight. So in conclusion, labels, museum labels, can be vague. They can be purposely misleading or lacking in detail. They can also reveal a lot by what they don't say or how they say it. What's clear, however, is that the loss of scientific study of these objects has occurred on a vast scale. Tonight I've picked on only US museums and collectors, but this is not the only market country. And these objects are still hot on the market, as can be seen by the Cleveland Apollo, which you can't see. There you go. And what they lack, the labels tell a tale of looting and destruction. And I'm showing you this picture on purpose. This is the Apollo in the Cleveland Museum of Art. Can you see what it's juxtaposed with in the back there? This is how it's set up in the museum today. So in speaking to the Boston Globe, I'm going to bring it back to this area. In 2005, Hecht, our old friend, said in an interview from his New York home that he was innocent of the charges he was about to face in Italy, charges of looting, selling looted antiquities. He also denied he had sold stolen works to the Museum of Fine Arts. He spoke warmly of the museum and mentioned attending a party there the previous December. He said he was angry about the charges against them and believed he was not being treated fairly. "You know the Bible, don't you?" he said. "When they were going to take Jesus to be crucified, he said, 'Forgive them, for they know not what they do.'" But museums do know what they do, and so do the collectors and the looters. And now we know what they do because of all of these archives, and what is hidden from the labels, but also, more importantly, will never be known. And I'll just end with maybe a little bit of positivity. What is the way forward? What can we do? Education and advocacy, stewardship and preservation. Museums can help by lessening the demand for antiquities and by privileging international collaboration and exchange with other museums. Instead of buying things, they can trade objects so that people in this country can see them and other countries can see their collections. Archaeologists can support the connections of locals to sites that they are excavating, and the sites can be used to support local economies. We can also publish material in a timely fashion, which is important for archaeologists to do, so that knowledge about the ancient world is available to the public. And as educators, we can make this information widely known, such as through lecture series like this one, and here's my only plug of the evening, and for instance, podcasts. Thank you.
We have a microphone. If there are questions, please wait until I come and give it to you. We're recording this for posterity.
Megan.
I have a question. I can't remember if it was Montebello or the head of the Cleveland Art Museum.
Yes.
The quote was like in
David Franklin.
yellow and then not yellow. But at one point he said these objects, one of those guys said, these objects were made to be art and to be seen as art. And I guess just that wasn't in yellow. But to me, that's like at the heart of what this problem is. And as someone who works on primarily indigenous North America, their objects are never seen as art. They're always seen as natural history or these things. But the long and short of it is like white people or things we see as white people descendants, things are seen as, of course, they're designed to be art. But there's no way to know something was designed as art. And I guess just, yeah, speak to that. The art market is what drives, or this aesthetic of people's classical stuff, of white people's descendants making this beautiful stuff drives the whole market, yeah.
Yeah, and he was talking about the Roman head, I think, in that quote. And that wasn't actually, those Roman portraits were propaganda, maybe not in the sense that we think of it, but advertising, right? Here's our important guy, this is what he looks like, we're gonna put his head on this nice, very handsome Greek body, and he's going to represent the ideal man, or whatever it is. So it wasn't just art, it's not at all just art the way that we would think, like this is to put in my nice study so I can have a Roman head to look at. Yeah, it's exactly like the quote from the Phoenix Ancient Art guys, right? That this is what's important. It's the intrinsic beauty and the aesthetic nature of these things. And certainly, if that's all you care about, then you don't need the context. But without the context, you know nothing about it. Yeah, thank you.
You spoke to the dealers and the looters being prosecuted, but are museums ever prosecuted for buying looted objects, or do they just kind of they're kind of complicit?
That's a good question. It's very difficult to prosecute anybody in this country because the laws might say, for instance, you can't take this out of this country, but it's not illegal for it to come into the US. Those laws are changing, but it is very difficult. I don't think that there are some examples of people associated with the museum. So for instance, Marion True from the Getty was put on trial in Italy. In this country, recently there's been some dealers that have been gone through the US courts, but it's very difficult to make that happen. And they also have like giant teams of lawyers, which I imagine keeps them out of harm's way.
It seemed like most of your examples, or at least the lion's share, came from the Cleveland Museum. And I think you touched on this before, but is the Cleveland Museum particularly bad when it comes to, or do most museums engage in these kind of practices, or is Cleveland just really, really bad particularly?
No,
Would be my question.
Yeah, I use Cleveland because it's close to me, geographically speaking. I could have done this entire lecture and not even touched the bulk of the Getty collection, for instance, but I thought I would spread it around. It's a problem with all museums that have antiquities, definitely, and those that have more money, like Cleveland is a pretty wealthy museum, the Getty, for sure, the Metropolitan, they can afford to buy these big pieces that make a big splash.
I have a question about a certain set of looted artifacts, the Parthenon marbles. So
We're gonna
in my
get into
class, me and a group did a project on the Parthenon marbles, and now that you're here talking to us, I was wondering what your view on them was. Specifically, we have apparently, as we did the project, we learned a lot about how the marbles were looted, such through loopholes through a firman that was issued to the person in question. But still, the British Museum still refuses to give it back, and the British government has said, like, this is our view, we're not giving it back, even though we know that they've been looted. So I guess my question to you is, do you think that Parthenon marble should be returned, or do you think that we can't change what the museums or the actual governments have been saying?
Well, okay, so first of all, I don't think the British Museum admits them being looted. But there's the legal debate, the legal side of that debate is whether or not that firman was a document that can stand up in a court of law. Greece won't try to get the marbles back legally because of the difficulty of that situation. As an archaeologist, I certainly think that they should go back to Greece. The museum that has been built in Athens to bring them home, if you want to put it in very emotional terms, is fantastic. It's state of the art. When you're there, you can see the Parthenon, and you can see all of this. They've done it very cleverly. So you go to the Athens Museum, the Acropolis Museum, and you see these gaping holes where the objects are from the British Museum. So they're making a point, certainly. And this debate has a lot to do with nationalism and ownership, and repatriation in general is a more political situation. But from an archaeological perspective, if we could see those marbles next to all the other ones that they were designed to be with in the place that they were designed to be, we might learn something more about them. We can't put them back on the building, right? But we could get more of a context if they came back, if all the pieces were together. Yeah, whether or not we'll ever see that, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Really great talk, thank you. And the characters like Hecht are incredible because from like a cultural anthropological perspective, like these people are in a very particular mindset. Like he probably sees himself as a steward in some ways. Like I don't see him like as a snidely whiplash, but he's like, I'm preserving this like for the market when it wants it, right? Like, I mean, the colonists also thought they were stewards, right? In a way. My question though was, what were some of the geopolitical or cultural factors that precipitated that 1970 UNESCO treaty, right? You said like museums don't typically buy things
Yeah,
after the
so-
70s? So what like led up to that? I'm interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, there were a series of laws. In fact, those laws regarding antiquities actually came out of environmental laws in the 1960s. So, and they took the U.S. did not ratify that UNESCO treatment in 1970. We didn't ratify it until 1983. So we weren't immediately attached to that rule. But so it took a while to get on board with that. But there were historically laws that led up to that, as far back as laws that governed behavior towards artifacts in times of conflict, for instance, and then in 1954 there was another law, I'm just forgetting the name right now, which led up to this, along with those environmental laws in this country, about protecting cultural heritage. Then 1970, that rule came out in UNESCO. We ratified it in 1983, and it's still, it says we agree not to bring these things in, right? But you can enforce it, and there's a lot that the other countries, the source country, has to prove in order for that to actually be in effect. The Hague Convention in 1954 is what I was trying to think of. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Wow, sorry, I didn't realize how loud I was. So I work at the UNH libraries, and you touched very lightly upon the idea of if museums were able to kind of communicate back and forth, we might have a lot less issues. And through the UNH library, we do a thing called like interlibrary loan, where like if you have a book that's embossed and you want it, you can request it. Do you think that if museums kind of had a similar system in the sense of like, back to like the marbles, if somewhere in the US was like, hey, we have these things, and through their inter-loan system sort of was able to bring things back, have them learn more about them and be able to bring them back, do you think that would help a lot of the issues of looting, because it would always end up coming back home in a sense? Like if there was that interconnectiveness
Yeah.
through museums, sorry.
I think for sure. I mean, I think that is certainly the way that museums should go, and that they are going. So there have been recently some very important agreements between the Getty and museums in Italy and in Greece to share their works with the Getty, which has an amazing conservation lab, and where these things can come. Say there's a statue from Sicily, it comes to the Getty, it's conserved, painstakingly paid for by the Getty. It goes on display, it does a tour of museums in this country, and then goes back to Italy. And the Getty has, in the past, aided the local museum even in setting it up in a more secure way. For instance, anti-earthquake stand, something like that. So it's certainly happening. It's expensive and a really big deal to move, particularly big objects from around the world. The British Museum, right, claimed that they couldn't possibly move them, and then they did, right? They sent one to Russia. But yeah, absolutely. If we can continue to do that, because then we could get these amazing things, right, that are all around the world that you might like to see, and maybe you can't get to Greece or you can't get to Italy, but they can come here under those agreements. It would be really cool if we could do that more.
Hi, I have two questions actually, and the first one, has there been any kind of criticism that's gone towards the auction houses? Because I know that the museums, they have these collections for a long period of time, and that gives a lot of researchers the ability to see like, oh, this doesn't really add up. But have there been any auction houses that have really come into a lot of question?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Christie's, Sotheby's, they all now have provenance researchers that are supposed to be finding these things. One of the ways that dealers used to launder, maybe they still do, ancient artifacts was to put them up for sale, let's say Christie's or Sotheby's, put them on auction, they get an auction number, so they're recorded as being on auction, they're assigned this number, and then they withdraw them. So that they are sort of laundered into legitimacy. I don't know that sort of thing happens anymore. But certainly they need to be more careful, and they do now have people that are supposedly doing their research. Yeah.
And my second question, just on the head that you had covered, that was found to have been stolen from a museum after World War II. Do you know any of like the specifics, how they found it, if the museums had done so much research into it and just missed it?
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Right? Yes. I don't remember the story exactly. There was another very similar head that had come from that museum, and it was determined that that one came from the museum, and so then the link was made, well, is it perhaps connected to this one? And I think that they had then gone through the archives of the museum to find it. But it doesn't seem to have been that hard, right? Yeah, I don't think they did their homework, is the end of that story.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions.
So my family and I, we love art museums. We love museums of any sort. So as a frequent museum goer, what is kind of your advice for critically looking at something like this and being able to educate other people in terms of what's going on? Because I'm sure a lot of people who love the art of going to see art aren't typically expecting this kind of history, and it's something that may be shocking to them. So how would you, I guess, look at it another way and kind of continue to enjoy it?
Yeah, I mean, do you think you would enjoy it if there was a plaque that told you something about the history? And I think once you know this story of these artifacts, you can't really unhear that. So now, next time you go to the museum, you might look at the label more carefully and say, okay, what does this tell us about where this came from? Or what do we know about this artifact? And I think that, for me anyway, it would be really cool to have more information about the object. And, sometimes, you don't necessarily want to read every plaque that's in the museum or every label, but if you did, the information should be there, right? And now a lot of museums will have this information on their website. So a lot of the images I showed you with the provenance, which is the modern history, you can find that on their website. So maybe you're not going to look at it when you're looking at the art, when you're enjoying it maybe, but you can look it up later. But you should, it would be really interesting, right? If you're looking at this, say, bronze, you want to know where it came from, right? You can appreciate, certainly I appreciate looking at them. They're beautiful. But that's not everything. So I think if you're going with your family, you can say, let's look at this label really carefully and determine if we can learn something about this object or not. And then just think about it.
Okay.
Well, please join me in thanking Zoe for this wonderful talk, and thank you for staying that late and asking questions. One last plug-in. If you found that fascinating, go check out her podcast with her DJ voice at www.lootedpodcast.org. I know some of our students will read it for tomorrow's class, but those of you who are interested, there are 4 amazing podcasts there. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you.